right, so last time we were looking at creating a university application. Okay, and I was supposed to give you an assignment, but I thought it would be better if I explained everything in the class. So today I will give you the assignment and it will be due next week. Okay? So anyway, the purpose of this assignment is to first of all have a good understanding of the inheritance issue. Okay, I remember the purpose of inheritance was to write as less code as possible so that we can reuse the code. Okay, so purpose is code reuse. Okay, so inheritance only makes sense when we are creating many different classes, right? Okay, so as we discussed in the last lecture, in the beginning nobody knows what class to create. So you are given some kind of a requirement. For example, if you have to create an application for a university, you start taking a look at what are the physical things that exist in this university. So physical things that need to be represented. Okay, so obviously students are a big part of the university. So we have students, right? We have faculty, we have staff, we have buildings, we have dorms, and so on. So anyway, you can keep taking a look at, all the different things we need to create in our system. So then we further discussed last time. We may have many different kinds of students. So for example, we may have a part-time student, we may have an undergraduate student, we may have a graduate student, we may have a PhD student, okay, so anyway, once we have identified these are the things that actually exist, then we'll start creating a class over here, we'll start creating a class over here. Same way we'll go to staff and create a class for a staff. For faculty, we'll create a class, right? So anyway, as we start creating these classes, as we discussed in the last lecture, we'll realize ourselves we are repeating things, okay? As I mentioned, anytime you're doing copying and pasting, a little bit of copying and pasting is okay, but if many times you're copying and pasting the code, then you're not doing something proper from good object-oriented programming point of view. So at that time, you should take out the code that is common and create what we call a base class, okay? So let me go to the computer, start creating some of these classes, and then the rest of those I will leave it for you to enhance and finish as an assignment. So okay, so once I'm in Visual Studio, I'll create a new project. So File, New Project. Okay, last time we already had created a folder called CS440 2015, I think. So CS440 fall 2015, right? Okay, so anyway, so location, I'll set it to our fall 2014. In case you run Visual Studio and you don't see the correct location of the main folder, you can always browse, create the folder if it doesn't exist, so that this part is, the location part is pointing to the main folder, okay? Then suppose we call this University App. Okay, so that's the name of the project. So we'll create a subfolder in the CS440 fall 2015. We'll select Windows Forms application, make sure the language is Visual C#, Windows Forms application. So anyway, name of the project, University App, location CS440 fall 2015. So once I click OK, we'll create some skeleton code for us. And then we will start adding classes to the project. And we can also write some test code as well. Okay, so if I right click on name of the project over here, the University App, then I will add a class to it. So if I right click on it, okay, add. Okay, so I can do it two ways. I can go add new item and then select a class, but if you take a look right at the very bottom, there's also an option to add a class. So I'll just pick a class over here. Okay, so let me start with the undergraduate student. Okay, so again, it doesn't matter which class you start out with. As we discussed, even if you started out with some class which doesn't make sense to start out, you yourself will recognize, you'll go back and adjust it, right? So let me call this class UG student. Just like Java and C#, if you create a class, the class name starts uppercase. So U uppercase, G uppercase, student, S uppercase, right? And that's a class, and so I'll click add. Okay. And at the bottom is the output window. You can always close these windows and bring them back. Once you run it, if you are displaying some output to the console, then this window will be needed. But so that we can take a look at more code, I'll close it. Okay. And now let's start creating. Remember, as we discussed, all code we write should be inside a class. Okay. At the very outside is the name of the namespace. So the last curly is end of the namespace. The second last curly is end of the class. So in between, we'll create some room. And let's decide what fields we wanted. Last time we discussed we will have a first name, last name, ID, test1, test2, right? So string first name. The default in C# is private, unlike Java where the default is public, okay? So private fields start lowercase, as we have discussed a few times before, okay? Then corresponding to this private field, if we right click, refactor, encapsulate field, it will suggest public property name with starting with a capital letter. And usually this checkbox will be checked. If you can uncheck it, because whatever suggestion it gives is pretty much always correct. So this will save you time. And now if you click OK, it will write the public get and set.
How did you do that again?
Right click on the private field, refactor, encapsulate field. If you have the, what do you call it, the community edition of Visual Studio, that option may not be available.
Okay.
So if that option is not available, then of course you can type it yourself. So then you will do something public.
They're under quick actions.
There it is, even in the community action?
But it is under quick
And
action.
there is pen.
Okay, and how do you get to the quick action?
Right click on
Right click?
Instead of refactor, there is quick action.
There's a quick action? Okay, all right. So good to know then. And then under quick action, is there encapsulate field? Okay. All right, so for the community edition, you'll go right click, quick action, and then encapsulate field. Okay. So anyway, let me quickly go now and create all the remaining fields. So last name, and right click, refactor, encapsulate field. It will give you an extra blank line. I try to keep the private field and the corresponding public property together. So anyway, make sure above the last two curly braces you are adding the fields or the methods to the class. Now int ID. By the way, I forgot to mention one more thing. In C# there are what we call aliases, or think of it as another nickname. Okay. For example, string is actually a class in C#, very similar to Java. Okay. So there's two ways you can write a string. You can write a string with capital S, or you can write a string with lowercase s. Both are identical. So lowercase string with lowercase s is basically replaced by the class string once the compiler compiles it. Okay. Okay. So anyway, int ID. Let me refactor and encapsulate field. Okay. Now if I go next one, int test1. And right click, refactor, encapsulate field. Okay, then in test2 and right click, refactor, encapsulate field. So all the 5 fields are there now, right? Okay, so now suppose as we were creating this, we also have a method to compute the grade of the student. So public string, so the method will return a string like A minus B plus. So remember, before we write a method, we always indicate what is the return coming from the method. So in this case, it will be A minus B plus C whatever, so it will be a string. Okay, followed by name of the method. Method names in C# start uppercase.